All right, folks. Well, welcome to tonight's class. This is going to be a fun class, and I think, and actually, as I was piecing together the information, I was like, this really should just be called gardening because we should all be adhering to these principles. I guess maybe the biggest difference is fertility and pesticides, as as a couple of extra tools for conventional growers. But anyway, I digress. I was just thinking as I was putting this together again that if we all did these things, wow, we'd all be growing bumper crops in no time. Just to get some housekeeping out of the way, if you have questions, let's do like we've always done and pop those in the chat box, and I can pull those off and send y'all a digital copy of that tomorrow so everybody can see the answers to those. And last week several of you were responding to questions and had thoughts, comments, and ideas, so feel free to share those, and we'll again pull those off and make those available to everyone in the Google Drive. Speaking of Google Drive, I've been trying to send the agenda out on Friday afternoon just to kind of give you an idea of what the flow for Monday night's class is. And along with that, there's some links in there to the Google Drive. If you're attending tonight for the first time, you will get another email with those links, so don't worry, you'll have access to watching all of our videos and access to all of our supplemental materials, which there are quite a few for tonight's class. So again, just keep your microphones muted. If you have questions, throw them in the chat box and we'll get those, and we'll just jump right in here. So again, welcome. So tonight we're going to spend some time talking about what organic specifically means. We often have folks that might get some terminology maybe a little confused, or maybe don't know exactly what the word means, especially when we compare that to natural and conventional, using some of that terminology. We're going to look at why organic gardening matters. We're going to talk about 5 steps to building a healthy organic garden, and then ways to take action in our own garden. And hopefully you'll get some inspiration. I know right now we're just getting ready to get into the fall gardening, but I think 2021 is going to be a year where we're going to see a lot more folks growing gardens, whether that be in containers, raised beds, or in the ground. So what does organic mean? There's a couple of big differences that stand out against conventional gardening or farming, homesteading. It basically means that we have no utilization of genetically modified crops or those genetically engineered crops. We're not going to be using synthetic fertilizers or any synthetic pesticides. And remember, pesticides is that umbrella for herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. So that's going to be all encompassing in that regard. So just remember that. Organic means that we're going to utilize methods that help promote that biodiverse ecosystem that you always hear me talking about. It's going to help us promote ecological balance. So when you're purchasing organic at the grocery store, you'll typically see this seal on those food products. It was back in 2000 when the USDA actually established the National Organic Program, or NOP, for farmers, and that is where these definitions actually came from. There are specific to home gardeners not really any regulations. Oftentimes when we talk organic, that's on a commercial scale. Where you have access to purchasing large amounts of fertilizer, any of those biocompounds, and even seeds. But when we refer to home gardens, maybe technically we're going to use that term organic loosely, but as far as a home gardener being organically certified, it doesn't really make sense. It's really expensive to go through that process. And if anybody's from Tennessee, in the Google Drive, there is some links to how you can go about obtaining organic certification, or if you're just interested to see how your commercial counterparts do that, you can see what that process involves. But for all intents and purposes, we're here tonight to speak to how we grow organically and grow more natural and not do the things listed here on this screen. And let me also mention too, because I don't have a slide in here, there is a publication in your Google Drive on transitional organic. So although we might not be looking to obtain organic certification, maybe you're somebody that has just purchased a farm or a home, you're not sure what is being grown there in the past. You're not sure what kind of chemicals or fertilizers or anything like that that may have been used even on that lawn if you go to turn that lawn into a garden. So there's this publication in there that talks about transitional organic, and it's basically not using any of these things for 3 years until you can get to that point and actually claim that you're organic. So that's just some terminology to get us started. Just to throw some information in on GMO, and I also put a folder in our Google Drive specific to GMO. So there's about 5 documents, I think, in there. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but GMO, just to give you some historical background, is a genetic modified organism, and it was first approved and grown in the United States in 1996. Of these crops listed here: soybean, field corn, cotton, canola, and alfalfa. This was just through the utilization of plant breeding, genetic engineering, which we often lump those together under biotechnology. It's just allowing those plant breeders to take a desirable trait found in nature and transfer that from one plant to another that they're looking to improve. So some of those traits might include resistance to insects, let's see, and disease, tolerance to herbicides that are going to allow farmers to not, have to use quite as many herbicides, that kind of thing. Currently, today, there are 10 crops that are available via GMO. You're not going to see some of these fruits and vegetables on the shelf in our supermarkets, though. But to make you aware, they are these 5 listed on the left, and then also these here on the right. So papaya, sugar beets, squash, apples, and potatoes, and then sweet corn also has been genetically modified. There are other crops around the globe that have been GMO'd: eggplant, sugarcane, pineapple, safflower, some of those crops as well. Rice, that's one of the big ones too. Let's see, what else do I want to say here? Like I said, I put some of this in your drive. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but this just gives you a schematic to kind of show how that process works and how that's evolved. And just as an FYI, we see that label in the supermarket, non-GMO, because it's very likely you're eating foods that might have been made with some of those GMO crops. So when we see sugar beets, 99% of sugar beets today in the US are GMO. So if you're eating granulated sugar, for instance, then most of that's going to be GMO. Corn syrup, cornstarch, corn oil, canola oil, soybean oil, all those things have the potential to be GMO, just to give you some background there. And to take it back, if you're one of those nerds like me that likes to know where things comes from, in 1978, insulin for diabetics was actually created as a GMO. So there's also a document in your Google Drive if you want to go in and read that. But biotechnology, these things have been around for quite some time and being used on an international scale. But that is one of those things within the umbrella of organic that we do not utilize. Okay, so moving on. Why does organic gardening matter? What, besides those 3 things, what is setting it apart? Why is it so much better? Well, number one there, it is helping us reduce pesticide exposures to ourselves, to the environment, that's going to include water, runoff, any of those type things. It's going to help protect nature's biodiversity. It protects our watersheds. A lot of folks forget that water cycle sometimes. It's going to encourage recycling from the small level all the way up to just the basic, rainfall. Think about rainfall and acid rain that we've often seen in the past. Even those things we can help reduce that footprint. And then probably a biggie, especially in today's current age, is saving money on groceries. It's just cheaper if you're growing organic, because we all know how expensive too that organic produce is if we purchase that in a supermarket. Okay, so let's jump into the 5 steps to our organic garden. And number 1 is building the soil. This is going to be the foundation and the basis for any of us. And I'm going to give us some pointers here tonight, but hopefully y'all will join me back in a couple of weeks when we talk about soil for about an hour and a half. We'll get really in depth. So I'm just going to try to hit the high points tonight. But especially if you're growing organic, the soil is where it's at, y'all. We've got to get our soil right before we can do anything. It is truly the heart and soul of organic gardening. We want to build that soil up. We want to keep it healthy. Oftentimes here in East Tennessee, our soils are going to be really heavy clay soils, and those are going to be really easily waterlogged and difficult for root penetration to occur. So we want to have that really deep, loose, friable soil, and that's going to allow for maximum root depth. And that's essentially really important for organic, because we want to be able to push those roots down deep. That's going to be important for any garden, but especially when we're going organic, the more that we can get that plant established and the less stress that it's going to incur, then the better off it's going to be in the long term. So again, starting from the ground up, it's all going to be about that balanced soil. We want to add organic matter to our soil. That's going to help with drainage. It's also going to help with water holding capacity, and a new term you're going to hear in a couple of weeks, cation exchange capacity, which is really important and critical for the plant's nutritional or fertility needs. It's going to provide a healthy habitat for soil microbes and other decomposers. You know, we want to encourage the populations of these, you know, and we talked about this in our composting class a couple months ago. You know, we want to have those critters because they are actually a huge benefit to our garden. They're going to help us build that soil profile. They're leaving behind waste, which also is going to add to that organic matter capability. We're going to hopefully be utilizing cover crops and green manures and things. You know, we're going to talk about that again in deep detail here in about 3 more weeks. But all of those are going to be required to help break down that biomass. And then, of course, the soil is just the #1 key to the overall garden and plant health. And here you can see vermiculture or earthworm farming. We always talk in organic about making sure, again, we have high populations of earthworms. And I know populations for some may be maybe a little high. We've heard of that occurring, but most of the time, having an earthworm, a healthy population, balances that out with our soil. So I've never seen too many earthworms in any gardens, I guess, in the last 20 years. So I've never seen a major issue with that. I've heard of it, but never seen it. So earthworms are good. They're, again, going to contribute to that organic matter. You know, a few other things we want to consider is minimizing tillage depth, even planting in stubble, whether that be in raised beds or whether that be in ground. We want to avoid compaction, you know, rototillers, those type things. The implements that we use in conventional beds are oftentimes going to increase compaction, and we want to get away from that. Utilizing cover crops throughout the season, you know, having something on that ground 12 months out of the year. Soil solarization, by incorporating those practices, that's going to help us get a hold of weeds and insects and diseases. But we've got to do it the right way for it to be effective. And then we can recycle potting mix. We just want to make sure that it gets heated and that we're not carrying over any kind of disease organisms. But you can heat that and certainly be able to recycle that. And there's some information in your Google Drive on how to do that, as well as soil solarization. So again, organic matter is the key. I can't talk tonight, y'all. Because the organic matter is what is really going to improve that soil structure and drainage. I can't say that enough. And it's going to hold nutrition in the soil, and it's going to release that over time very, very slowly. Whereas a synthetic fertilizer, if we go out there and throw a 10/10, it's going to be a really quick boost of nutrition, but it's going to leach out really quickly. This is going to be pretty steady throughout the season. You're going to have to make multiple applications usually, but it's going to be more steady. You know what you're actually applying. And another point on the organic matter, it's not something you can do one time. It's something that's going to be ongoing from each year, because you want to continually build that soil profile every year. Types of organic matter, and again, this is something we'll expand on in a few weeks, but any kind of crop residue, as long as it's not going to be diseased, we want to burn that material if it's harboring any disease or insects. Any green plant manure cover crop, that's a living cover crop, so think alyssum in your potatoes, even red clover throughout the summer months. Any kind of compost, that being animal and plant waste, composted animal manure. Any kind of plant waste, recycled kitchen scraps, anything like that, and then utilizing crop rotation. We want to be able to identify, who the givers and the takers are within our plant systems. So again, if this is so key, where does it come from? And again, it's any once living thing is basically what organic means. So you can even, again, make it yourself. Go back and watch our composting class from a couple of months ago. You can actually purchase compost, but again, recycling those food scraps, grass clippings, as long as you're not spraying anything on that. Paper, be cautious, don't use the glossy, shiny stuff. Any kind of leaf, just be aware of some acid content there. And then any kind of mulch, whether that be something like straw mulch or pine bark, anything like that. We just always want to keep that ground covered. It's going to reduce weed pressure, but it's also going to continually help build that soil. And again, we did spend quite a bit of time on composting a couple months ago, so please refer back to that, go back to that folder and pull some of those supplemental materials out if you missed that, or watch the video, because I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here, but make sure you get that recipe right, constantly turning it to make sure we get optimum O2 in those compost bins. When we talk about our soil being healthy, we're doing all this, we're incorporating our organic matter, but how do we know if our soil is healthy? We want it to look kind of like this, a crumbly loam. We want it to have a pH of about 6.0 to 6.8, unless we're growing a crop that's going to dictate that we need to have a lower pH, like blueberries, or if we're going to set aside a part of our landscape for rhododendrons, azaleas, camellias, Pieris, japonica, any of those type things that are going to require that lower pH. But optimum for vegetables and most flowers is going to be 6.0 to 6.8. We want to have an organic matter that is at least over 4%. We say 3% for big ag, I think is what's on our soil test. But if we can get over that 4%, then that's going to really provide great soil tilth and drainage and things like that. If you're not sure about these things, do a soil test. If you're a first-time gardener getting started, or if you're a seasoned gardener like myself, go in and take a soil sample every couple of years. Know what your baseline is. I've told this story, so I apologize for some of you that have heard it, but we planted blueberries in trials out at the research center last year, April of 2019. When we started, our pH was 6.5, and I can't remember exactly how much sulfur we added to the field, but it was an enormous amount. But when we come back this spring to soil test, our pH had actually gone up to a 6.8. So we're kind of redoing that entire field, had to dig up the blueberry plants, and we're going in and actually going to add a lot more organic matter. We're going to make sure we get enough sulfur and do soil testing once a month to make sure we get that to where it needs to be, because pH is always going to revert back to its normal state. So it's another one of those things you're going to have to stay on top of. But I digress. I say all this to say that we really need to know where our pH is so we know where we're starting from. It's something you don't want to guess at. It's going to save you time and money in the long run. Okay, step 2, we want to think about the right plant, right place, and then the time associated with all that, and then just timing in general. So that's a multifaceted approach. When we are thinking about planting our gardens, and some of us are going to be doing that right now with fall gardens, or again looking into the spring, we always want to purchase healthy seedlings. Y'all have heard me speak more than once about, if you're buying transplants, pull those out of the container, whether it's at Lowe's or the local hardware store, investigate those roots. You're going to purchase that and take it home. So it's just like trying on a pair of pants at the Belks or whatever. You're going to try it home before you take it home. So same thing with these transplants. Make sure you've got nice, white, fluffy roots. You don't see any evidence of insect or disease on there before you take it home. If you're purchasing seeds, make sure you know the differences here. Open pollinated seeds are going to be those classic plants that we say breed true, and those are the ones that you're actually going to be able to save seeds from year to year. They're going to produce traits that are going to be characteristic of that parent plant from which those seeds were harvested from. These hybrids, like this second pack here in the middle, those are going to be the ones that are created by breeders who cross-pollinate to combine a desirable trait. More often than not, that's going to be something about disease resistance. So like in tomatoes, Fusarium wilt. You know, we used to have a major issue with that in tomato production. Commercial scale, and which filtered on down to the consumer scale, to our level. So those kind of things, for the most part, in a lot of our newer hybrid varieties have been bred out. Anytime you see this F1 right here, then that's going to tell you that that is indeed a hybrid seed. And if you see that F1 on the seed pack, then that's telling you don't want to be saving that seed, because you don't know if it's going to come back true to form like an open pollinated or an heirloom. Organic seeds, again, if you're purchasing those, they're not going to be GMO. That's something you're not going to have to worry about. They're not going to have any kind of pesticide on them. If we are buying conventional seeds, oftentimes they'll be pre-treated with Thyrum, or some kind of insecticide, or some kind of pesticide for disease or insect resistance. It's going to vary depending on what we're purchasing there. But all of those seeds are going to be grown under organic conditions. So know what those differences are, and take the time to really research some of this. We're in the middle of August right now, so if you can, if you're not going to grow anything in the fall, really spend the next few months acquainting yourself with some of that terminology. Looking through some of those seed catalogs, getting an idea and a vision for what you want to do at home. And it changes. For those of us that are seasoned gardeners, we know that we're constantly changing or moving plants around. That's just how we operate as plant people usually, and nothing wrong with that. But just, again, get acquainted with some of that terminology. Now, when we talk about planting in the right place, that oftentimes I'm usually always teaching to the fact of planting in ground, but don't let that take you away or steer you away from container gardening or raised beds, because the same principles are going to apply. This says 6 hours of sun. I typically, for the most part, would like to have gardens in as much sunlight as possible, because that's going to help reduce a lot of our weed or disease and insect pressure. Make sure when you're thinking about a new raised bed or a new garden spot, or if you've already figured out that you need access to water, that's going to make it a lot easier on you too. And then protecting it from critters. And one of the reasons we state that is because some of these fertilizers that we're going to use for organic often will attract wildlife species. So think about your bone meal and your blood meal. Sometimes those will actually draw in skunks and the neighbor's dog and that kind of thing. So just be conscientious of that. And of course, just our typical wildlife species. And I guess another thing to mention here too is that any kind of taller crop that you have, if you can plant that to the north of shorter crops, that way they're not going to be shaded. They'll dry off a lot quicker for you. So that's another thing to kind of think about. But again, we've got some schematics in there that'll show you some different layouts and things, and we'll speak to that in a couple of weeks too. Just to touch on disease resistance again a little bit more, VFN, if you see that, that means it's going to have resistance to Fusarium, Verticillium, and root knot nematode. This Verticillium is one, if you are growing in an area, a lot of people don't think strawberries and tomatoes can get the same type diseases, but they can. You don't want to follow one with the other. So some of those things, if you have had some issues with that, or you're dug up strawberries or something, for instance, and want to plant tomatoes, be aware of this. Once it's in the soil, it's there. So planting a resistant variety will help control that. The heirloom varieties are wonderful. That's where we get all of our flavor. They pack a very flavorful punch, but they're not always going to be resistant to diseases. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're planning, as far as preventative spray measures on the organic side of things. Always keep that in the back of your mind. Choose varieties that are going to be adapted for your local growing conditions. I know we have a lot of folks on here that's not even in the Southeast, that you're in the New England or even in the upper Midwest, Lake region. But just make sure you adhere to your.
Can I play for 30 minutes?
I don't know. Melody, you can do a mute all. Participants and then mute all.
I know, but you muted me too. That's okay. We're good. I unmuted myself. Okay, thank you for whoever did that. Thank you. All right, so minimizing plant disease, again, we want to be proactive. We want to get ahead of that curve, and I keep repeating a lot of this because the more I repeat it, the more it's going to kind of stick in y'all's brains. Resistant varieties, really explore that again. If we're growing an organic garden, that doesn't mean that we can't utilize some of those hybrids. We've just got to make sure we know what that source of that seed is, okay? So look at those varieties, and I'm going to go ahead and throw a plug in here because I haven't elaborated on this yet. I will in step 5, but that journal that you always hear me talk about in classes, this is where that comes in handy. If you have been growing a garden all summer, hopefully you've been keeping up, you know, with the insects and the disease and the weeds and any kind of weird climatic changes or whatever Mother Nature is throwing your way, any kind of issues you've had, hopefully you're keeping track of that, because that's going to help you plan for 2021. And as I've said before, anytime you have an issue with like cucumber beetles right here or pigweed, hairy galenzoga, you know, I know that's what I'm going to be continually fighting. So I've got to figure out what's going to work best in my situation. So my journal from year to year kind of helps me do that. Okay, enough about that. So your environment, you want to be able to manipulate your environment to favor the plant and not the pathogen. And we're going to speak more to this in a couple of weeks. But a lot of that's going to be moisture management because we don't want to be watering overhead, okay, because that's going to increase our disease pressure. And then you'll notice there's sanitation and crop rotation, and we're really going to talk about sanitation next week. We're going to devote an hour to that, which is going to help minimize this biggie right here on plant disease. Site selection, again, we want to have well-drained soils. That's going to help us discourage those water molds. If we have water freestanding in our raised beds or our containers, then that's going to be a perfect host site. It's going to invite some of these pathogens in. We really want to focus on root growth. Again, we often forget when we plant that seed or we plant that transplant that, you know, the biggest bulk of energy for that plant initially is below that soil line. And we want to give it everything we've got to start out with because that's going to create that healthy environment and get it off to a good start. Promoting rapid air drying, we're going to do that by spacing our plant rows, spacing in the plant rows, how we're placing our location for our garden or our beds or our containers. We want to physically separate from other crops in the same family. Crop rotation, again, this is a facet of that. Potatoes and tomatoes are both going to carry late blight, so we don't want to be growing those right on top of one another. Peppers and tomatoes can both harbor bacterial leaf spot. So, you know, all of these are in the same family. They're in that solanaceous family. So that's why when we speak to crop rotation in a couple of weeks, you're going to see maybe when you thought you were rotating, you might not have been rotating. So just kind of tuck that in the back of your mind, and we'll visit on that in a few weeks. Planting at the right time is going to be critical. Cool season, of course, like spring and fall. Warm season, of course, in the summertime. We want to follow those local recommendations. So when you go to Google Drive, you'll see those 4 folders, and then there's going to be our 2020 home garden calendar in there. That's going to have a reference to all of these things. There's some graphs and things embedded in that calendar that tells you the time to be planting. Frost-free dates are going to vary. They're going to vary even right here in Greene County. We're such a big county, and we have these little microclimates everywhere. So it's going to vary where I'm at in the neighboring county. So always, again, jot those things down in your journal so you kind of can be better prepared for the next season. The biggie here is just intercropping. We want to avoid monocultures. Think about our large production ag systems. Those are monocultures. We want to increase diversity as much as we can within our growing space, even if that's in containers. We want to use varieties that are going to fit our individual and specific needs. If you're not able to maybe trellis pole beans, you don't have a way to do that, then you might not need to be growing those. You might want to stick to bush beans. Things like that. You know, if you're not able to get some of those plant trellises or anything like that, then think about growing some of those smaller, more compact plants. And again, spacing is going to be critical, and we'll go back to that purchasing certified disease-free seed. We'll have folks that'll take potatoes out of the bin and cut those up and go plant those. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with that, but we know that's not certified disease free. So, you know, there could be an issue with that plant harboring some kind of disease that you can't see with the naked eye. So be really careful with that. You want to ensure good and adequate pollination. You notice there that corn, that means that we don't have good pollination. Corn's one that will really let us know. Cucumbers let us know. They'll be fat on one end and they'll now have a little curly Q on one end and it's really soft. That's usually lack of pollination. Some flowers are going to be only male or female, so you're going to have to carry pollen to the female. Drought, late frost, nitrogen fertility, all of those things can hurt fruit set. They can actually inhibit fruit from even setting. So we've got to be really careful with some of those issues too. Now, a couple of these we can't control, but things like the nitrogen fertility, we can. Even a late frost to some degree we can control if we are following recommended planting dates. Okay, so number 3, we want to be able to fertilize wisely because we're going to do this a little differently than how we do in conventional gardening where they're using synthetic fertilizer. A healthy soil, we're going to go back to point 1. If we have a good healthy soil, it's not going to require as much fertility. And don't over fertilize because again, that's going to inhibit fruit set and we can actually get less yield. Now we'll get some really beautiful lush green foliage, but we won't get that fruit set. And then when we get that really flush of nice green foliage, that's also going to invite some of those teeny tiny insects that we talked about last week, the aphids and the thrips and the whiteflies. They love that succulent growth like that. So that's another reason not to push the nitrogen. This is where it's always good to be able to refer to that soil test to know exactly what your soil needs. And it's going to vary widely even in the county because our soils are kind of all over the place. We've got soils that are going to be high in P and K and you might not even need to be making any additions of those. But we have some areas, or you yourself, may, be low in one of those, and you're going to have to make quite a tremendous addition to that. So again, soil testing is a good practice to get into. Just establish that baseline, pay attention to what your plants are telling you for the next couple years, and go from there. And again, remember that any of our organic fertilizers are going to be really slowly over time versus the synthetic, which is that really quick boost. Some of these organic fertilizers are only going to contain one ingredient, like only P or only K, and some may contain actually a lot of secondary minor nutrients too. So make sure that you know what your soil needs again. Here's a picture of the garden tone. This is one that's pretty familiar with organic growers. You've heard me speak about the bone meal and the blood meal, fish emulsion. These are all widely used in organic gardening. But remember, they're not going to be quite as strong as the synthetic counterpart. So just keep that in mind. You might have to make additional supplementation throughout the season. So like the garden tone, it actually has feather meal, poultry manure, alfalfa meal. It's even got potash in it. So there's a lot of different ingredients in there that may or may not suit your needs. So again, know what you're getting. Some of these will even have good microbes in them as well. If you apply any fertilizers to soils that are depleted of organic matter, it's not going to work very well. You're going to need organic matter in that soil because that's what's going to help hold that fertility in and release it slowly. If we don't have that organic matter in our soil, then basically all of this is just going to go right on through. Kind of like, it's not the same as synthetic fertilizers, but you know how quick synthetic will leach out? Well, it's why we need organic matter. It's going to help hold those nutrients in place and release slowly over time. You can make your own organic fertilizer. So there's a few recipes in the drive that'll explain how to do some of that. Making a compost tea or a composted manure tea. You can add any of those approved organic additives. And again, some recipes there that you can adhere to. I'm not going to go through these, but they're spelled out for you to refer back to. All right, that brings us to point number 4, the fourth step. We want to manage problems organically. Now, before we get into this section, let me just preface by saying that, last week we talked about garden or insects in the garden and the landscape. A month before that, we talked about weeds and how to control those and identify those for best control. And then I guess maybe a couple months ago, we talked about plant diseases. So we're going to see some of that embedded here. Hopefully that's going to serve as a refresher. Some of you may have seen some of this, but when it comes to organic gardening, those are things that we're really going to have to be on top of from the beginning. Before we plant the first seed, we need to be aware. That's another reason journaling throughout the season is going to help you be able to better predict and know how to be proactive in the coming years. Okay, so one of the first things that you can do is destroy any egg masses of bad bugs. And you see some of our bad critters pictured here, the Colorado potato beetles, the squash bugs, stink bugs, all those egg casings that are going to be on the underside of the leaf. So that's why it's going to be really critical to get out there and scout and investigate under the leaf. So if you have kids or grandkids, this is a great way. They usually love going out there and squishing bugs for whatever reason. But you can also take these adults and drop them into a jar of soapy water to get rid of those pests. This is where knowing your pests, making sure you get an appropriate ID on the pest is going to be critical too. And again, what we talked about last week, knowing what those individual pests are and their life cycle, so you can hit that window of opportunity to garner better control. We want to be able to exclude pests with row cover, and I think somebody had a question about this last week. I don't remember exactly what it was, but these row covers, I typically will call them Remay or old tobacco canvas. I don't think they're sold under that name anymore. It's what we used to cover tobacco plants before we moved to the float bed system, but oftentimes you'll hear them referred to as floating row covers. And they are a great tool in an organic garden. You can see the different mechanisms here they've used, but not only is it going to give you some frost protection on either end of the season, but it's going to help repel pests. So let's go back to last week. We talked about the cabbage loopers, the imported cabbage worm, the cabbage looper, and the diamondback moth. And remember, I always say when those butterflies or those moths are flying around in the springtime, the little white ones, we get all excited because yay, pollinators are here. But those are cabbage loopers, and if we've planted a spring crop here of like the broccoli or the cabbage, then they're going to lay their eggs down on the inside of these plants, right? And so those cabbage heads or those broccoli crowns are going to form, and we might not actually see those egg casings. They're going to blend right in with that crop. But if we install one of these floating row covers, whether we install the hoops or we just lay it over top of the plants, that's going to prevent her from laying those eggs. So that's going to, in turn, reduce the amount of cabbage loopers we have and the feasting on our veggies. This Remay, it's a lightweight fabric, and it's going to come in various weights. It just depends on how cool your spring or your winters last, I guess, into your spring. I'm not even sure what the weight. I meant to look that up so I could tell y'all, and I forgot to do that. I'll try to remember to put that in the chat box, though, when I copy it. Recognize your good bugs. If you didn't get to watch the beneficial bug class a couple of months ago, go back and watch it. We spent an hour and a half just on good bugs, and make sure you become acquainted with those. You see the ladybird beetle and the larvae there. Remember what they feast on? Aphids. And remember from last week's class, aphids are the smallest population of any of the insects that we have. I think it's 32,000, but each plant species is going to be affected by some form of aphid. So it's important to have these good bugs around. And actually the larvae are going to eat more than the adult, just as an FYI. These are lacewings. They're going to be really efficient at eating leaf hoppers, and leaf hoppers was the ones that we talked about vectoring bacterial wilt in oak trees. So they can be a really cool insect to draw in, and we're going to do that. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Immature or assassin bugs are going to eat, y'all know what this is? It's a Japanese beetle larva. So they're called assassin for a reason, because they're going to really feast on those Japanese beetles. So if you have a bad population of those from year to year, drawing in assassin bugs through companion plants is one good way to to assist with that. Again, just go back and get acquainted with the good bugs. We've got ladybug or beetle larvae here, spiders. You know, some people are deathly afraid of a spider, but if you see spiders in the garden, it's not usually a habitat for the brown recluse or the black widow. Usually those are garden spiders, and they're going to feast on all kinds of bad bugs. Praying mantis, she can be a good bug or a bad bug. We don't want to get too many of these because they don't discriminate. They will eat good bugs and bad bugs, so be aware of that. So that brings us to companions, and again, this is something we spent an hour and a half on back in the early spring, so make sure you go back and refer to that. Recognize that many flowers are going to attract and feed those beneficial insects like the assassin bugs. Dill and parsley, your mint, thyme, sage, and basils, all of those flowers that we plant in our garden, they're not just pretty, they serve a purpose. And then salvia and nasturtiums. And here's just a statistic for you. Only about 10% of bugs are bad, just as an FYI. So the beneficials far outnumber the bad bugs anyway. Companion plants, again, that's just planting species together that are going to provide one or more plants a cultural benefit. Oftentimes that's a symbiotic relationship. Sometimes we can plant one plant that's going to serve as a trap crop for a pest, and that way it's going to leave your vegetables alone. Many of you have heard me talk about cucumbers. I like the bush cucumbers because I like to pickle, but the cucumber beetles, I have high populations of those, so I'll often plant multiple varieties, and then the English cucumber is the one that they will typically go to first. Leave my picklers alone until I get done canning, and then, you know, they can have at will. But doing some of those type things are going to confuse insects. So some of those companion plants are going to repel. Some are going to make our veggies taste sweeter. Again, I'm going to put this handout from our companion planting in tonight, so you'll have that as a quick reference. But make sure you go back and visit that companion planting folder in our Google Drive and grab some of that material as well. Again, some of those potential benefits, they can also help increase pollination besides attracting those good bugs. Some can even be a source of fertilizer. You've heard me talk about comfrey, that it's a deep miner. It's going to pull those secondary nutrients from deep in the soil and provide nutrition. Some are actually going to serve as shade. Some can be weed control, and even some that are going to serve as a trellis system. Sunflowers, for instance, would even serve as a trellis system and can be considered a companion plant, and increased yields. Trap cropping, I've kind of already alluded to this. A neighboring crop could be more inviting or more attractive to a pest than your main crop. Get your neighbor to grow something. I'm just kidding. But you want to plant your trap crop kind of like a fortress. So we'll go back to that diamondback moth in your early spring cold crops, the brassicas. If you plant collards, then that's going to draw those diamondback moths away from your cabbage. Now, if you like collards, I'm sorry, you're going to have to sacrifice one for the other, but collards will actually help draw that pest away from your cabbage if you're not going to utilize some kind of floating row. Blue Hubbard, I love this squash. I think it's very tasty and it makes great pies, and I just think it's a pretty squash. It's one of those old-timey heirloom varieties. But if you have the blasted, striped, and spotted cucumber beetles or squash vine borers, it can actually help protect your zucchini or your summer squash from those pests. But again, it's all about sacrifice, and I've not found the balance with all of this because I want them all except for the pest. So I'm still working on that. I'll keep y'all posted. Pest suppression, that's actually when we're going to suppress or annihilate an entire pest species or plant species, but some plants are going to release chemicals in the form of pheromones, and sometimes these pheromones or chemicals can come from the root, some can come from the aerial parts, it just depends. But again, think about marigolds. They don't just look pretty, they serve a purpose. They release that thiopene, which helps repel nematodes. And you notice how horrific the smell is of marigolds. That also will confuse some other species of pests, but they have to be that African marigold. They have to be really fragrant. Black walnut, we've talked about that several times. We don't want to be planting a garden close to a black walnut, even where the roots will come out, because they release the juglone. That's going to suppress the growth of many other plants. It'll significantly stunt those back. When we talk about cover crops in a few weeks, we're going to talk about some of the benefits. Well, rye as a cover crop, or even utilizing a rye mulch, is going to help suppress weed germination in the springtime. So you're going to get maximum benefit if we're incorporating some of these things. Spatial interactions, I've kind of alluded to this, I guess, with the sunflowers, but if we are planting tall growing and sun-loving plants, they're going to be able to share space with lower growing shade tolerant plants. So many of you have heard me talk about planting radishes throughout the season because flea beetles, they'll attract flea beetles, and then the flea beetles will typically leave your eggplant and other crops alone. Well, I noticed this year in my garden, I let the radishes flower, I let them bolt and go to flower because the Japanese beetles were only feasting on the radish tops at that time. And I was like, well, I'm just going to leave those. And I actually planted a few more underneath my sunflowers because those tall plants, even though radishes are a cool season crop, you can get away with growing them through the summer months by growing them in the shade of your other plants. And if we've got a diverse canopy of lots of different size plants, that's going to confuse and disorient pests. So corn planted with squash, that's believed to disorient the squash vine borer. And then, of course, those prickly squash vines are said to deter raccoons. They won't feast on your corn quite as bad. I don't necessarily think that's true. They've gotten around that. They've become resistant to prickly squash in the last few years. But one of these the best examples to use is the Three Sisters garden or the Wampanoag garden. You're planting that without plowing or tilling. You're planting the corn and beans in mounds. You're planting the squash in between those, and then you've got sunflowers along that north edge. And remember, we're putting those tall plants along the north edge because we don't want to get into a shade issue. So if you're interested in that and seeing how to incorporate that, I put some schematics in here so you can look at that and study that in a little bit more detail, and then just what a close-up of that would look like. Now, that doesn't mean we're planting that in a circle. It's just showing you here what it's going to look like from month to month. You can see there as it grows. You can see how that would be confusing to insect pests fluttering around. So this just shows you the progression of the garden throughout the season. I don't think I put this, so y'all might want to jot this down. I don't think I put this anywhere. ATTRA, A-T-T-R-A, is a great resource for organic gardening resources. So make sure, I'll try to put that in the slideshow before I send that out to y'all. Managing diseases, this is going to go back to that first point, choosing resistant varieties. Removing any diseased plants, we don't want to leave those out there. If we get squash vine borers or bacterial wilt on our cucumbers, don't just leave them laying in your garden. Go ahead and pull those and dispose of them, burn them. You don't want to be carrying any kind of disease to the compost bin. Some of those things aren't going to matter quite as much as others, but make sure you get it out of the garden. Pruning and trimming plants. You don't want everything to get real close together, that foliage, because that's not going to allow air movement, and that's going to increase our pathogens. And then rotating crops, that's going to help us manage disease as well. So talking about pest control, we have talked about several of these in the last few months. Many different ways to achieve this, from cultural and mechanical all the way up to biochemical pesticides and biological warfare in a good way. So it all begins with monitoring and scouting. This is a component of integrated pest management, which is what IPM stands for. And we often speak to that in conventional ag systems, but it also is going to be effective here. We all need to be practicing this, whether we're employing organic or conventional tactics, because we got to know what we're dealing with before we can start to treat it, right? This is where inspecting again under the leaves, always looking, investigating thoroughly, looking for those signs and symptoms. And then a biggie here is checking soil and nearby weeds, because sometimes they can harbor disease and and pests that we might not think about that are contributing to the problem going on in our gardens. Mechanical and cultural control, that's all going to go back to site selection and that garden location, proper row spacing and airflow. We want to make sure that we're, again, pulling any spent plants and composting all that plant debris, rotating again, and then irrigating properly. And we'll speak more to that in a few minutes. But you'll notice a lot of this is repetitive, and I've mentioned crop rotation and cover crops several times. That's why we're going to devote, well, actually the next 3 Mondays, we're going to devote to cleaning up the garden, soil basics, pulling soil tests, rotating crops, employing cover crops throughout the season. So make sure you stick with us on that, because this is going to help bring all of this full circle. Oftentimes when we think organic, we think about hand picking a lot of those pests. Sometimes we'll utilize trapping systems. A stem collar is what I was talking about last week with squash plants. Many of you had other ideas that you shared in the chat box, using the toilet roll holders to plant seeds in, using the little ring around the gallon milk jugs, aluminum foil, anything like that is going to help repel cutworms, squash vine borers, and things of that nature. Utilizing garden structures can actually help, because again, we're going to have varying plant heights that's going to help disorient pests. Mechanically removing weeds, usually that's going to be with a hoe or just hand pulling, and then utilizing mulches. It's amazing what utilizing a mulch in a garden setting is going to do for you. Culturally, we're just talking about sanitation, and again, we're going to devote next Monday to all of this, but we really want to focus here to exclusion. We don't want to be introducing any new pests, so that's why sanitation, and we all know we're hearing all about sanitation here in the last 4 months. It's the same with our garden implements and tools, and next week I'm going to give you some cool ideas on how to do that to help reduce a lot of these right out of the gate in the springtime. And again, crop rotation, we're going to spend a lot of time on that, but that's what I was saying earlier. We want to rotate among, not within, plant families. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to do this to get, again, the most yield for your garden. Moisture management is going to be critical. We want to be watering earlier because we want that foliage to dry out before nightfall. And think about August. You know, August is known for fogs. It was pretty heavy fog this morning, coupled with a heavy dew, more so than maybe June and July are. Well, all of that dew and fog is going to contribute to the total wetness overnight, which has the potential for harboring disease pathogens. So that's just going to be an extra step in helping us reduce that pressure, is to allow that foliage to dry out, because it's going to get wet overnight anyway. Stay out of the garden when leaves are wet. That's going to help you reduce any spread. Organic mulches, again, whether it be a living mulch or an organic mulch, we want to make sure that we're employing those. And then when we think about that site selection, making sure that we orient those rows parallel to the wind direction. And that's going to vary for each one of us, but each of us should know how those wind currents are coming in on our property. As far as some biological controls, again, those are going to help us improve soil quality. They're going to help us reduce insect and disease pressure. That's where all those cover crops, green manures are going to come into play. Then our natural and organic pesticide. Just remember here, if it kills a pest, it's a pesticide. So even organic materials are going to fall under that umbrella of pesticide that I was talking about earlier. Keep in mind that whatever insecticide or organic insecticide or that we're using, it has the potential to kill our beneficials. It's not going to be selective in that matter. Organic pesticides are going to be made from natural sources, but remember that organic doesn't always mean non-toxic. And then last week, if you remember talking about rotating your chemistry, rotating your mode of action, it's going to be the same with organic materials as well, because how that material is killing that pest or affecting that pest may be different from product to product. So we, again, want to be really schooled on that, and there's a list in your Google Drive that's going to spell all those out for you. So if you get under some really heavy pressure, you know, you don't want to be utilizing the same product time after time the entire season long. Alternate that with something else. Let's see if I had a note here if I was going to say anything else. I think we're good. Okay, so some common organic chemicals are going to include soaps and horticulture oils. That even includes our dormant oil that we're applying to fruit trees in the wintertime. Copper or any of those secondary nutrients that we're purchasing individually, sulfur, molybdenum, sometimes zinc, boron, all of those are going to be organic chemicals. White vinegar and even just hot water. So some of those insecticides made from natural products, we spent more time on this last week, so just refer back to that. Pyrethrins, again, your insecticidal soap, any of those garden safe killers. BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, is going to be an excellent control for caterpillars. Spinosad is going to give you some season-long control of some of the beetles like the Colorado potato beetle. And then you can even, I should have put a picture of this, Surround has the kaolin clay. A lot of folks are starting to utilize that a little bit more in their gardens too. So that's going to help a lot with beetles, any of those true bugs that we talked about last week. Just remember that these are going to probably have to be applied more often because these are not necessarily going to kill the eggs. And, you know, that's another reason rotating that chemistry is going to be critical. Biopesticides are going to have a narrow target range and they're going to have that very specific mode of action. So anybody that's taken my IPM class has heard me say, always read the label, read the label, read the label. I say it 500 times during that class, you know, always read the label so you know what you're dealing with. And the same goes with organic. Just because we're organic, again, doesn't mean that we're necessarily less toxic because some of those products are going to have some toxicity associated with them. But make sure you read the label because that's going to tell you what that mode of action is and the target range. Remember, they're slow acting. They're going to have more specific critical application times than some of our conventional pesticides. Again, that's going to go back to the timing of that life cycle of the pest, the disease, or the insect. We want to suppress rather than eliminate a pest population. Well, we'd like to eliminate, but most of the time we're going to be in suppression. It's going to be really hard to eliminate. When we think eliminate in an outdoor environment, think Agent Orange or DDT. Those are the type chemicals that eliminated. So we're always going after suppression. Biopesticides are going to have limited field persistence again. They're going to have a short shelf life, so you're going to have to utilize those quicker than some of the conventional chemistries. Typically safer to humans and the environment than our conventional. No residual activity going on in the soil, so we don't have a pre-harvest interval or PHI, if you've ever seen those field signs. And there's two types of biopesticides, biochemical and microbial. And again, we've already touched on a lot of these, but just to throw in some more of that diatomaceous earth. That again is going to be excellent to use on soft-bodied caterpillars or bugs, anything like that. It basically just shatters their insides. And chemical biopesticides, again, the pheromones, which is pyrethrum. It's made from chrysanthemum. And they're just naturally occurring chemicals that insects are using to locate mates, is what that is. Man-made pheromones are going to be used to disrupt the mating by creating confusion as that insect searches for a mate, or it can be used to attract male insects to a trap. So there's lots of different mechanisms that this can work. Pheromones are often going to be used to detect or monitor insect populations. So think about the ladybug. We've used to utilize those frequently, but then it was determined that those may actually draw the pest in. So if you didn't have an issue, you didn't want to be using the trapping system. Think about garlic spray, pepper spray, citronella, neem oil, rotentone. All of those are going to be an example of that biopesticide. Bug juice and even copper. Many of you have heard me say when we've talked about fruit crops to always invest in copper and sulfur. Those are a couple of things, and sometimes even iron, depending on where your pH is. So oftentimes those secondary elements can actually provide a good boost of supplemental nutrition to a lot of our organic crops. We get a lot of questions about controlling whiteflies and aphids and spider mites, and I left the D out right there, sorry about that. But this is just a plain Jane recipe for you to go by. When I say dishwashing liquid, make sure that it's not any of that fancy new stuff, that it don't have any grease cutting property. Buy the cheap stuff, you know, the Dawn, the plain Jane Joy. You don't want any of that grease cutting because it can cause phytotoxicity in your plants. But you can use that with cooking oil and water and spray that on plants every 10 days. And you see there from USDA is recommending spraying that on many different vegetable crops. And that's also in your Google Drive on a separate sheet of paper, so you don't have to go through the PowerPoint to find it. Suppressing weeds, that's another, that we're still in number 4. You see how big this one is, right? Managing problems. This is always the biggie. But suppressing weeds, we want to do that because once weeds take hold, it's virtually impossible to get a hold of them. That's why we want to plant cover crops throughout the season, because we don't want any open area in our garden. Besides that, weeds are going to steal nutrition from the plants we're trying to grow. They're going to serve as oh my gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? An incubator for plant diseases, or they're going to serve as a home for insects, you know, so all kinds of bad things for weed control. But it's been proven time and again in organic farming systems, organic gardening, homesteading, the best suppression is going to be mulch. They're going to help suppress the weed seeds. They're going to help us retain moisture, encourage those populations of beneficial insects. And mulches made from the organic materials are going to be better just because they're going to break down and they're going to continually keep building that soil. Of course, the choice of tool is going to depend on what specific weeds you have, what your population of those weeds are. Weather conditions can actually influence this, and then just like soil type can. And we've talked about how we see specific weeds growing in our lawn or in our gardens, then that's going to tell us a lot about the soil underneath that. You might want to go back and refer to that, especially if you're going into the ground for the first time in 2021. Just remember some of those specific characteristics of annual versus perennial weeds. They are going to be adaptable to many environments. They're going to have a long seed life. They grow rapidly. We all know they overtake everything else in our garden. The biggie here is that they're going to have that high seed production. You can see that pigweed there. Not only are they going to have high seeds, but they know how to disperse them, and those seeds know how to take hold really quickly. A single plant can have up to 100,000 weed seeds. Same thing with the perennials. The only thing about perennials that's probably going to make it a little bit different is that they are going to have that food storage capacity because they're coming back every year, time and time again. So the longer that those weeds are left there, then the bigger that food storage capacity is going to be. Plus, they can have regenerating parts, whereas an annual is going to reproduce by that seed. A perennial weed can reproduce by multiple means. Think the rhizomes in Bermuda grass, stolons, bulbs, different mechanisms for different weeds. So knowing again our weed species is really going to help us be able to cut down on those populations, which is going to help us inhibit some of the pest pressure that we have. Compost carefully, because even some of those weed seeds can live through a compost pile. We talked about that about a month or so ago. The seed threshold is going to vary from plant to plant. Y'all have heard me complain about Harry Galanzoga, and the little flower is teeny tiny, and there might be 50 of those little flowers on one plant, and each one of those are going to have about 40,000 seed. So that's why I'm never going to win against Harry Galanzoga. But knowing what those seed thresholds are, maintaining your field edges, and by field, I'm not saying that you're in a big in-ground garden. This could be if you have containers on your front patio. Keep the weeds away, maintain clean edges, because anytime that we have a lot of stuff growing up, that can draw varying insect pests in. It can even lead to a higher threat, potentially for disease organisms, depending on what those are. So always keep your garden edges, your landscape beds clean, and get rid of the pest. Diversifying is going to be huge. Remembering that different crops are going to support different weed compositions and populations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that tonight because, again, we're going to cover this in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about how to implement these cover crops to be effective on shallow-rooted versus deep-rooted weeds. Again, how are you going to know this? By writing these down, identifying what those weeds are, keeping a journal of that. So come 2021 or every year thereafter, we're going to know what that pressure is, and we can start implementing a plan to get better control. This is going to be really critical for organic because we are reducing those conventional chemical pesticides that we can use in a conventional system. Knowing crop families. I know that master gardeners here probably heard me talk about crop families till they're sick of it, but it's real important to know what those families are and knowing where even flowers and weeds and vegetables are all going to be a part of the same family. Knowing what those relationships are is going to help us be able to better plan for a rotation scheme. All of these things are going to help us reduce pest pressure in the long run. And then it's all about timing. We all know if we can catch those weeds in that white thread stage when they're just teeny tiny, it's so much easier to control than when they get up and bigger and they start producing those seeds. You can't plan the weather, so you got to have more than one option at all times. Because if we do get out there and we're hoeing manually, then after it's been wet, then of course that helps us lead to compaction problems. So as you can probably tell from the first 4 steps, it's all about putting the jigsaw puzzle pieces together, manipulating the system to make it work best for you. So step 5 is just about observing and caring for your garden. Observing, again, this is where that journal comes in, making sure that we know what we're dealing with. Manage the weeds throughout the season. Destroy the bad bugs. That's where it's going to be critical to know the difference between the good and the bad. And I promise the more you're out there in your garden, the more you're going to discern those relationships. Fertilize if you need to. You don't want to be over fertilizing. That's again why a soil test is going to be critical. You want to implement succession planting. You don't, even if it's going from vegetables right into a cover crop, that's going to be an example of succession planting. Or you can plant cucumbers or radishes throughout the season and just keep planting those, and they'll be at different growth stages throughout the season. Water wisely. We've already touched on this, but water in the morning, not in the evening. Make sure you water the soil, not the leaves. The leaves will never benefit from washing unless you're directly washing off but egg casings or something like that. Watering deeply, less often. This is another critical point for organic. I've really preached on this in past classes, but you don't want to be out there watering every single day, because what that does again is promote that shallow root depth rather than forcing that plant to grow its roots deep. When those plants can set their roots and go deeper, then they're going to be able to access water that we can't even see that's in that soil. That's where organic matter and building our good soil health is going to be so critical, because we want to make sure that we have that cation exchange capacity and good water holding capacity. And don't worry, those are things we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, so you'll understand all those relationships a little bit better. Investing in drip irrigation or soaker hoses is going to be a huge asset for you. And if you take care of those throughout the season, they can actually last multiple seasons for you. As the season ends, again, we're going to spend all next Monday night talking about that, but removing that plant debris, mulching bare soil, and then planting crops like garlic and shallots even to get you through the season, or turnips or any of those greens, and then the cover crops. Prevention and maintenance, that's going to be key. And again, it's okay to recycle water. You see that rain barrel there. I've already talked about some of that. Cultivating or tilling, you can do that at shallow depths. You don't want to be doing that too deep in an organic system because of the weed potential. Pruning and using plant structures and ties. A lot of folks don't realize how imperative that is in any gardening system, but that's going to help increase our airflow and get, where we can actually see those plants better, and harvesting is much better too. So there's the 5 steps. to our organic gardening: building the soil, right plant, right place, fertilizing wisely, managing our problems organically, and then observing and caring for the garden throughout the season. So just as a refresher, we want to use the best management practices to sustain our produce, vegetables, and our flowers. The reasons for that, you can see there are a multitude listed there, and maybe yours is not even on there, but many people want to grow organic for health, for personal health reasons, the environment, for their pets, suppression of allergies, exercising, just the challenge of it, and just peace of mind, just to name a few of those. Remember, when we are going into an organic gardening system, and again, this can be in-ground, raised beds, containers, whatever, remember that there's no quick fixes. So whereas in conventional we have those quick fixes like pesticides, we've got burn down herbicides, we've got insecticides, and then we've got an arsenal of fungicides that we can utilize. There's no quick fixes when it comes to fertility like there is in conventional, where we can go out there with ammonium nitrate or a triple 10. This is something that you're going to be spending a little bit more time on. So some people find that challenging. Time and labor expense can be a little bit more just because you are spending more time, especially if you're scouting and making multiple applications of any of these materials. Building your soil, again, this is not something that you do one time. It's an ongoing process. It's got to continually be done to keep that soil healthy. Organic nutrient sources, making sure that we're always feeding the soil. And a lot of times organic growers will do that with composting or incorporating those mulches. Knowing those population cycles, again, that's going to be imperative for insects. Study up on your personal climate, and you heard me talk about this a minute ago. You know, in Northeast Tennessee, even in the upper 8, we're going to have varying microclimates. Even within the same county, it's always going to be like that. We can adhere to the big picture, but when we really get down to it, we need to pinpoint our specific location. There's a lot of things that are going to influence that. Like Glenn, where he's at, you know, the mountains, at the base of mountains are going to be a little bit different than if you're along a riverbank. Or, you know, if you're in the north end of the soil or county where you have shale soil. So lots of different things are going to have the ability to influence the climate and everything here. And then if you are growing for a tailgate or farmer's market, remember that, you know, society's tolerance, consumers' threshold for imperfection. You know, some people don't want to see the little brown spots on their apple, or they don't want to see a earworm in the top of their corn. But oftentimes if we're growing organic, those things are going to come along with that. So just it's about altering mindset and acknowledging that even you yourself as an organic grower, that sometimes we've got to take the good with the bad. Planning ahead, I've spoke to all of these already, but just trying to bring it full circle for you. Garden location is going to be critical. Think about, again, those tall plants on the north slope. Think about your wind flow. That's going to be a little bit more critical. All of these things are going to benefit you in the long run. Your plant and seed selection, knowing keys to prevention and management strategies, always monitoring for any kind of pest and controlling them, and then post-harvest, which is what we're going to spend again next week on, cleaning up that garden. So I'm going to spend just the last few minutes here talking about something that might be a new term for some of you, but it's called farmscaping, and that doesn't mean that you have to live on a farm to do farmscaping. This can be even if you're living in an apartment or in the suburbs, or if you're on a farm or a homestead, whatever, you can apply these principles. But farmscaping is just basically a whole farm approach to increasing and managing that biodiversity with the intent of attracting and maintaining populations of beneficials. And I know we spent a lot of time on the beneficials already a couple of months ago, but again, the more that we can attract those, the better off we're going to be. So some of the components associated with farmscaping are going to include hedgerows and windbreaks. We're going to have those blocks or insectary blocks, borders, or strips. Cover crops, snags, natural or undisturbed areas, ponds, ditches, and riparian areas, the inclusion of nest boxes, and even bolting crops. You already heard me talk about allowing my radishes to bolt. So I've got just one slide real quick as a brief introduction for each one of these, and then I'm going to let y'all go. But hedgerow or windbreak, that's just a linear barrier of trees or shrubs or any perennial grass, and that's going to be planted along the edges or in between your fields. It's going to help you basically reduce wind erosion, or any kind of crop desiccation. And you'll notice though that it can provide a microclimate and habitat that's going to attract those beneficials. Insectary blocks, borders, or strips. Think about planting a row of zinnias in your garden or a row of marigolds. Basically, that is an insectary strip. You could look at it that way. Planting the wildflowers along the edges of your property, planting wildflowers in containers next to your tomatoes on the patio, planting just a row of sunflowers even. Those could be considered a border or strip. So I've got here, ideally you should time your bloom to meet the needs of beneficials, and so they're not going to compete with the crop, and then you don't need to be spending a lot of time on those. So I used zinnias as an example. So remember that we start with a little teeny tiny seed or one little plant, but they tend to bush out and grow. So make sure you maximize your space, or think about those needs when you are planting your garden, if you're incorporating those in your garden. Cover crops, again, we're going to spend more time on this in the next few weeks, but the biggest thing here is that they're going to alter our soil moisture and temperature. They are going to provide that habitat for spiders and ground beetles over the winter, and we're going to consider these beneficial insects. They can also serve as those insectary plants that we were just talking about, wildflowers. Buckwheat and clover, we'll utilize those often as a green cover crop, a living mulch throughout the summer months, great pollinator. Same thing with the vetch and the mustards and the cowpeas in early spring. And you can mow those. You can mow right over these, and they're just going to keep coming back. Think about the Queen Anne's lace we see on the roadside now. You know, if it gets mowed down by the state maintenance crew, what do you see in a week later? They're already starting to come back. They're smaller. The heads won't be quite as large, but they'll keep coming back. Snags are going to be any dead trees that can provide a shelter for our native bees. Some of those solitary bees like to build in beetle tunnels. Just keep it trim and maintained. That could just be an added benefit on your property. Any natural or undisturbed area, that's going to provide a habitat for our native pollinators. And remember, pollinators can be anything from the birds to the bees and anything in between. So anything that you're wanting to draw and provide a habitat for those pollinators, certainly have those areas on your property to do that. Even soil piles and rock outcroppings can be included in that. Ground nesting bees are going to prefer those bare patches. They don't like wet ground, so you'll often see those on a slope. Our riparian area, or we've often heard Andrea talk about some of our wetland areas, including those. When we have these areas on our property or nearby, they're helping us promote biodiversity. We're basically incorporating another microclimate even within our own property, and it's going to provide a continual habitat. So if you like to feed the birds, or whether you don't like to feed the birds are going to help eat insects. Now sometimes they too won't always be discerning. They'll just eat everything, but these habitats for even our birds can help control insect pests. Nesting boxes for mason bees. They can be encouraged by creating some of these artificial nests, and you can see a picture there. You want to provide some kind of shelter though to protect from the elements. And I don't think I put it in there yet, but in the Google Drive I'll put I'll go back and get some information on these nesting boxes. And then bolting crops. That's always going to be maybe a point of contention with some folks. You know, some folks want to go ahead and get that out of the garden, but if you can leave those after harvest, as long as they're not diseased, that can provide those beneficials with a nectar source. You again just want them to be healthy. So even after, if you've not harvested all your dill or your parsley, or again even those radishes I was talking about, they're beautiful flowers. You know, I mean, you're going to lose all of your fruit potential or your root potential underground, but by allowing them to bolt, then you're going to draw in some of those beneficials, give them a food source. In the end, it's all about creating diversity. I've said it. It's probably one of the phrases y'all hear me say it all the time, creating biodiversity, a biodiverse ecosystem in our at our homes, however that looks to each of us. Remember that the more crops that we plant together, the better chance we have of reaping a harvest. It goes back to that monocropping culture I was talking about earlier. If we try to go out there and just grow one crop, we're technically probably not going to be too successful on our scale as a consumer home gardener. If we can plant more varieties of a single crop, that can also help us reduce pests. I told you about the cucumber beetles and the different types of cucumbers. Another example, this is from UC Davis. They found that mixing broccoli varieties actually helps reduce an aphid infestation. So there's lots of different ways to employ some of these tactics. But basically what it all goes back to is, again, keeping a journal of all of that, knowing what you've got to deal with. If you're just getting started, you know, keep that from year to year. It's a growing process, and even those of us that are seasoned gardeners, and many of you I know on here, you know what I'm talking about, especially with the introduction of a lot of these invasive pests and invasive diseases on the forefront now. You know, we're getting thrown curveballs all the time in the gardening realm. So, you know, even things like pandemics with COVID not only affecting us on a personal level, but we have things like that that have been affecting our garden and cropping systems for years. We'll think we get one thing under control and then something else gets introduced. And it's like, well, now there goes all the ash trees. You know, there goes all the walnut trees. It's always something, it seems. You know, the latest thing, the spotted wing Drosophila, and then the kudzu bug. So we're always dealing with something new. But when we take that home and we kind of keep a journal of all those things, it really helps us be able to plan for the future. And then things like this, like creating a Google Drive. One reason that we've done that and taken the time to do that is so you can go back and refer to that anytime you want. One thing I probably should mention, you know, I've broken those out by classes, by dates, by topic, those folders, but some of this material might be in multiple locations. So for instance, in the organic section tonight, I'm going to go back and put some of that companion plant and beneficial insect information in there, but then you're also going to have a folder specifically dedicated to each one of those too. But hopefully this will provide a resource outlet for you to be able to refer back to on occasion, just to help you be successful in your own gardening endeavors. So what I'll leave you with is, if you've had questions, I will pull those out of the chat box and look at those and get those sent out to you like I did last week. And I'm going to keep adding things to the Google Drive. So if this is your first time on here, don't worry, you'll get a link to that. If you've not joined up yet, make sure you do that. There'll also be a video that goes along with this as well. If you have comments, questions, anything like that, don't hesitate to reach out and send that to us, and we'll get them answered. You can also go to our Master Gardener website and submit a question via our Ask Us portal. I think our team is all on here tonight. So Glenn and Jenny and Katie. So make sure that you utilize that, because we're here to see you succeed in your gardening endeavors. And remember, just because I'm on this side of the fence doesn't mean that I don't learn from y'all too. So I really appreciate it when you put things in the comment or in the chat box. So it's all about learning from one another. So don't hesitate to reach out and share is what I'm saying. So I hope to see y'all next week. We're going to talk about cleaning up the garden, and then we're going to get rolling with the soil and cover crops, and yeah, really get growing. And then we're going to have fun in September. All right. Thanks, y'all.